So thank you everyone for tuning in. Our next speaker I am particularly excited about. His name is Coleman Little, and he is a visiting lecturer for the University of Central Arkansas. And he is going to give us an overview of Arkansas native bee communities. So Coleman, if you'd like to share your screen.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's going to make it difficult for me. There we go. I have too many things open. All right. So this presentation is really just designed to clear up a lot of the confusion that has been around native bee communities. We seem to have a lack of understanding. So the main point of this presentation is going to be to give everyone just this general overview as what native bees really are, what to look for, and the types of things that they respond to over a landscape. So with that, I will go ahead and begin. All right, so first of all, I mean, you know, this is a Monarch sort of a conservation forum, and it really just all relates to pollination, right? So we have monarchs pollinating as well as we have a lot of native bees. So it's around 78% of our temperate zone angiosperms require some sort of animal-mediated pollination to either promote gene flow or just to reproduce in general. That number fluctuates depending on what habitat you are in. It gets up to as high as 98% in some tropical areas. Right? But bees are the best just sort of all-around pollinators. Monarchs are magnificent for promoting gene flow and things like that. But when you look at aspects like seed set, pollination efficiency, number of individuals pollinated, in the majority of habitats, bees are going to be your best pollinator. And just highlighting that habitat sort of dynamic, some areas, particularly cold areas, Arctic and alpine sort of regions, flies tend to become your dominant pollinator in those habitats. There are some islands where mammals have become the prominent pollinator because these bees and butterflies are not present in those areas. So, again, the idea here is to address this problem of our understanding of native bee communities. So, what is it that you actually think of when you think of a bee? Right? Most people, it's going to be honey, a hive, a queen bee, that whole eusocial structure that is present in Apis mellifera, also known as the European honeybee. But the thing is, the European honeybees are very, very strange. The majority of other bees are not doing anything like what honeybees are doing. Bees are extremely complex, and we're going to cover that complexity a little bit throughout this talk. But most of your bees are going to be nesting differently than honeybees. Right? They are going to have a completely different social behavior. And the big thing that honeybees do that most bees do not is hoard pollen. Okay, there's 7 honeybee species around the world. None of them are native to North or South America. So, other bees that might come to mind when you're thinking is bumblebees, maybe. We certainly have already talked about the rusty patch bumblebee today. Some people are able to differentiate a carpenter bee from a bumblebee, and that's great. Those are definitely native bees, but then our understanding kind of breaks apart at that point. Right? We have this other term, which I really don't like, sweat bee. Right, which I believe, and I'm probably not correct about this, but in my opinion, it is the worst common name in biology because that term spans 3 different families, right, and it basically just means small metallic bee. There's a lot of very small metallic bees. So I find it a very just too broad of a term that doesn't really explain what it is that you're actually looking at. So, all right, the majority of our understanding of bees, right, is this red bar right here. Right, this is a stacked bar chart, so it's showing 100% of our bee species. The top portion in red is all of the honeybee and bumblebee species combined. Right? Most of us, when we think of native bees, we are only thinking about that very small portion of bees. Okay, so I am going to try to increase our understanding today and explain the rest of this blue bar, which is the remainder of bees. Okay, so in general, what is a bee? Well, it is a really large group in the order Hymenoptera, right, which includes things like ants, wasps, velvet ants, and sawflies. Right, they are most known because females have a modified ovipositor. Right? We call them stingers, right? But it's an ovipositor. Therefore, all male bees do not have stingers. Stingers are only present on female bees. Right? If we were to get into the real taxonomic differences, it is very specific characteristics of the pronotum and the pronotal lobe. So it's not exactly easy to explain, especially the pronotum is right here when you have hair covering these different structures. Basically, the more and more bees versus wasps that you look at, you can just kind of see it. You can look at an individual and tell it's a bee from a wasp because you start to cue in on those characteristics. And then we have scopa, which is a structure that bees use to collect pollen. Is going to be present on most, okay? And this most thing is all too often said with bees because there are so many exceptions, okay? The scopa is not going to be present on males. Males don't really do any pollen collection, as well as not all bees are even collecting pollen, okay? So bees are incredibly diverse. There are 6 total families, 443 genera from around the world, and over 20,000 species. We are continuing to add more and more species as we are paying more attention. In general, they are very strict vegetarians. Okay, their only source of nitrogen, so the only way that they can assemble proteins and DNA is through acquiring pollen. This makes them incredibly dependent on plants, except for these guys in Panama, right? So Central America, right? There are actually 3 species of bee that they gather pollen, right? But they also get nitrogen from decaying flesh. So they also collect carrion. These bees are referred to as vulture bees, and they are an exception to bees being dependent on plants. Just about every rule you can come up for with bees, there is some sort of exception that you can introduce. Thankfully, in the United States, we don't have to worry about this particular exception. Okay, so what are bees doing when they are moving around a landscape, reproducing? Some of them are going to be using hives. This is a stingless bee hive, so this is something that you might find in South America. But bumblebees are going to have a hive-like structure. It's not like a honeybee. They'll have as few as 20 individuals in a single hive. It is much more of a small, intimate sort of hive when you get bumblebees. But you also have bees that bore into dead wood. These are your carpenter bees, and they can actually be quite a pest around wood structures. A very similar bee can bore into the pith of herbaceous tissue. Okay, so these bees are often in peril from mowing dead vegetation down this time of year. There are a lot of bees that are nested inside the piths, specifically of goldenrod around Arkansas. There's a lot of bee species that really prefer goldenrod piths to nest in. We have cavity nesters, and these cavities can be somewhat large, all right, to very, very small, just a very small crack in between rocks. They can provision a nest in between them. And then the most common, right, around 70% of bee species are going to be nesting in the soil. Okay, so again, most of the time you don't have this hive structure. Right? You have these other social behaviors. And here is a bumblebee hive with a queen, a worker, and a male. They are certainly more similar to honeybees than these other bee species. Okay, this constitutes a eusocial social structure. Okay, but there's also semi-social. This would be like our carpenter bees that we have in Arkansas, where they can collectively care for everybody's offspring. Okay, so they will collectively defend their nests from any sort of predator or invader, as well as collect pollen for everyone, okay, everyone's offspring. A very interesting behavior. Some of these bees to me are the most interesting, but there's parasitic bees. And that might sound confusing, especially because I've said bees are strict herbivores. Well, they have this parasitism that's called kleptoparasitism, where they will lay their egg in the nest of a different species, and they will steal the provisions that other species has collected for their young, thus parasitizing the nest, right? But they are still just eating the pollen. Right, solitary, very self-explanatory. They're solitary, they're by themselves, they do everything by themselves. This is the most common, right? And it, just like soil nesting, around 70% of your bee species are going to be solitary, right? You can also see them nest in aggregations. This one can be a little confusing because you'll just see a whole bunch of solitary bees nesting in dense areas. And we don't quite know if they are doing that because the abiotic conditions in that area is what they need to nest, or if they just nest in a group for safety. It's probably just a combination of both. And then there is communal, right? And these bees are going to share a nest entrance. There will only be one entrance into a nest, and then it will branch out into different individual nests. The way to look at this one is an apartment building, right, where everyone enters through the main entrance, but once you get through, you each have your own household that you are maintaining by yourself beyond that point. Okay, so again, eusocial is the weird one, right? Solitary is the more common one, but all of these other types of nesting behaviors you will see more common than eusocial. Okay, so how do you identify these bees? It's actually kind of difficult. You have to get, for most of them, you have to get a specimen under a microscope and look for some very small characteristics. Right? Sometimes there can be spiking patterns on their exoskeleton. Right? An old school way of identifying them is through their tongue morphology. Right? But you can also be looking at, this structure right here is called a carina. Right, the angle, shape, how prominent is it, and also the rippling pattern around it are all used to identify bees to species. Right? And then you can look at banding pattern, hair colors. Sometimes it just matters which direction the hair is pointing and tease out one species versus another. So I often receive photographs of bees, and I can really only provide a genus, right? And that is because some of these characteristics are just tiny, okay? So I'm about to cover all of the major groups and just give this broad overview, all right? This is more to just kind of increase your understanding of, if you see one of these things, is that a bee or not? Right, so the first family I want to get into is Megachilidae. Right? These are your leafcutter bees. Most, again, everything with bees is most, you can hardly ever say all, right, are going to be fairly large. They tend to have wider bodies. They're more robust than your typical bee. The scopa on the underside of the abdomen, right, that one is a characteristic that if you see a bee carrying pollen on the underside of their abdomen, it is a Megachilidae. Okay, they may or may not have that structure, but if they do have that structure, it is a Megachilidae. They all are going to have large mandibles compared to others. That's actually the name of the group. Megachile translates to giant tooth. That's where that comes from. The majority of these guys are going to be cavity nesters. And in total, we have 76 genera, 4,000 species. Okay, so fairly large group. In North America, you're only looking at 18 genera, over 600 species. Okay, this is what the face looks like, and I mostly have this. This is an Osmia species. I mostly have this to show you the large tooth, that giant mandible, and actually this is sort of a thing. A lot of bee species you can actually tell from a photograph of their face. They all have different personalities in their face. It's kind of interesting in that way. Other major groups, and I'm kind of saying major groups. This is also just to give you an idea of what else you might run into in Arkansas. This is going to be an Osmia. You can see that scopa, all right, on the underside of the abdomen. This is where this individual is going to be carrying pollen. They're usually metallic. It's going to be metallic blue or green, and a dull sort of metallic. These don't tend to be bright, though some are. There's megachile, which is the most common. This previous slide, this one is a megachile as well. They're typically black with white hairs, but there is a similar looking one called a hoplitis, and there are multiple other genera that I could be mentioning here that are similar but a little different. Okay, but you can see the major representatives here, and then they have their parasitic individuals. This one is an Anthidiellum. You're not going to find any scopa, and this thing really just looks like a wide-bodied wasp. Okay, moving on to the next major group, Halictidae. These are mostly small and metallic. Traditionally, this family was referred to as sweat bee, but that term, like I said, has since been applied to other groups. But this is the original sweat bee. This family is comprised of 76 genera and over 3,500 species, but in North America, we're looking at 16 genera and over 700 species. These tend to be very prominent, very abundant in different sites, but within the group themselves, they're very diverse. Okay, we have Halictus, very common in your more urbanized areas here in Arkansas, but you can also find plenty in the wild. Laceoglossum is probably the most interesting group here. I've got more to say about it later, or next slide. These guys are extremely diverse and have wide variations within them. Agapostemon is a very gorgeous genus. Pretty much all of them have this very bright iridescent color to them. But then you even end up with like this bee, Nomia. These are very large. They're bumblebee size. Okay, so even though these guys are going to be really small, some individuals in Halictidae can actually be quite large for a bee. But getting back to Laceoglossum, this is actually a very typical Laceoglossum. Right here, they're typically very, very small. We're looking at about 4 millimeters long if the abdomen was protruding correctly here. They tend to have a real dull metallic color, though that's not present on all of them. But they can be extremely small, and each species tends to have very, very different nesting and social behaviors. Laceoglossum, which we do have 400 species in the United States, has semi-social individuals. It has individuals that nest in aggregations, communally, solitary, everything that you can imagine. There's a Laceoglossum species that does it, and they are all incredibly difficult to identify. The majority of them you absolutely have to have under a microscope to identify them to species, which is problematic because each species is doing something very different. Okay, and some of them are doing similar things. The chance that each species is doing something very different is high. Calictidae is probably one of the most interesting families that we have around the world, right? But here in North America, we don't really have that many of them. Right? Most of these are going to be hairy, medium-sized soil nesters. Right? In total, there's 56 genera and only 469 species. So each species of these guys is going to be very different from one another, both morphologically and by their behavior. In North America, we only have 5 genera and just over 100 species. So we don't really have a great amount of diversity in this family. The two main ones that I caught, that I have caught in Arkansas are Coletes, and they pretty much are soil nesters, very seasonal. And then Hylaeus. Hylaeus is a very interesting bee because they do not have scopa, but they still collect pollen. They have actually modified their crop in their digestive tract to hold pollen to then transfer it to their nest rather than having scopa on their legs. So again, there's always an exception to some rule on bees. They're very diverse and can do a lot of different things. Moving on to the next family, Andrenidae, they are really known for having facial phobia. Right? And these are very hairy pits or depressions on their face. It's kind of hard to see as you're moving throughout a habitat. However, a lot of these Andrena and Andrenidae members look kind of similar to honeybees, at least to the untrained eye. So this is one of the main ones that you might get confused with a honeybee as you're looking around. You can see the numbers of the different genera and species there. Individuals in this group include Perdita, which are really cool. These are sand specialists. They love sandy soil. They're all very small. The smallest bee in North America is a Perdita. It's only 2 millimeters long. Here is the main one you'll find in Arkansas, Andrena. They're typically dark color, larger than a honeybee. Okay, this is Caliopsis, right? And I'm highlighting another thing here, which is very common in bees, which is sexual dimorphism. We just mentioned that with monarch butterflies. Bees have a lot of sexual dimorphism. Here's a male, here's a female, and you can see they look very different. And so if you are unaware as you are observing these different species, you might think you have 2 different species present, but you actually only have 1. Right, this has the common name of the lawn bee, right? So it's very, very common in suburban areas. I have caught a bunch of these around Conway. Right, then the last group, right? And this is the largest family of bees. This is Apidae, and it contains honeybees, so apis, as well as bumblebees. Right, but it's still a very, very diverse group. You can see the numbers here. This is by far the largest. In North America, we have 79 genera and over 1,000 species. Right? And here is about the extent of your diversity. Right? Up top, we have a parasitic bee. It's actually parasitic on Caliopsis, so the lawn bee that's right here. It is parasitic. So no scopa present. The thing is small. It's got white eyes. It's black and red. Really, really different from this thing that is actually not a bumblebee. This is an Anthophora. There's a lot of bee species out there that look like a bumblebee, but they are something different. Okay, which is kind of what I'm displaying here. These are all bumblebee lookalikes that are not bumblebees. This one is Tilithrix, and actually it's Tilithrix bombiformis is the name of it. It is a different genus of bee. It behaves in a completely different way from bumblebees, but it looks very much like one. Svastra is known for having huge scopa on its legs. Again, looks kind of like a bumblebee, but it's not. Melisodes also has very large scopa, same category. And then here we have a bumblebee for reference and saying how similar these things actually look. All right. Going through, these are sub-families, but again, it's just to show you diversity. Nomadinae is a parasitic subfamily in which you have some individuals that look very much like a wasp with matted hairs, or Nomada is this genus, the nomad bee, that we are just now discovering, and it has wide variations. It can be red, it can be white or black and yellow, it can be red, yellow, and black all together. These are very, very wasp-like, and we have just now recently, within the last few years, been paying attention to them. All right, and then lastly, the carpenter bees, Xylocopinae. Right? Wide variations here as well. We have carpenter bees. All right, the way to tell the difference between a bumblebee and a carpenter bee is the abdomen. If it is shiny and hairless, it is a carpenter bee. If it has hairs on it, it is going to be a bumblebee. All right, but really closely related are those pith nesters. Right? This is a Ceratina. These like to nest in the pith of things like goldenrod. And is a really tiny bee in comparison to other members of that subfamily. So what sort of things are going to impact bee communities in an area? One is flower species diversity. That one is fairly obvious. You have different flowers that different bees are going to prefer. So this graphic is a little overwhelming, but you don't need to read these different parts. These are called pollination webs. And basically we have plants on the left, bees on the right. The most general species is positioned at the top. The most specialized species are positioned at the bottom. Right? And what we see here is each plant that this bee went to, you see a line branching off of it and going to all these different individuals. This one highlights the importance of our generalist species because we have all of these plants right here would no longer have a pollinator if this one generalist left, right? But we also have specialist interactions where these bees are only visiting these flowers, okay? And so they are highly dependent on one another. But again, you can see the complex network of bees relying on plants and plants relying on bees. Okay, it is worth pointing out here that specialist bees tend to specialize in a genus rather than a species, and that is just due to flower morphology. All right, but also the plant material that a bee has access to is going to dictate what bees you have present in an area, right? The type of soil that you have, right? Access to dead wood or large cavities. But the plants matter as well. So for your leafcutter bees, they actually cut and fold leaves to make their nests. This is what the inside would look like. Right? And to some of them, it matters what leaf they're actually cutting up and putting in their nest. Some of them get as picky as lining the insides with flower petals. Right? But then your pith nesters are also going to specialize on certain plant piths. So soil is extremely important, and it's not just bare soil, it matters the composition of your soil. So this is a graphic showing you percent clay going in this direction, percent silt going in this one, and percent sand moving in this direction. So one, bees really like sand, right? But they don't really like 100% sand, right? And depending on which bee you are nesting in the soil will kind of depend on what combination of clay, silt, and sand you prefer. So agriculture, right, tends to be one of the most devastating things to native plant assemblages. And it's pretty easy to consider why. You have large acreage of homogeneous plant species that are only going to be blooming for, maybe 2 weeks out of the year. That is a lot of missed opportunity for other plants to provide nectar and pollen. But you also have large acreage of homogeneous soil, right? With tilling and plowing of these areas, you're basically making everything the exact same, which will only be good for a bee species. But then also, as you are plowing these fields, you're destroying bee nests. So even if they did nest in this area, their nest would likely get destroyed. So as we're not going to be able to stop farming, all right, that's obvious. And there's been a lot of research that shows simple things like adding an unplowed strip in between your crops not only increases your pollination efficiency, but it will increase your seed set more than the crops you lost by not planting that area. So it actually seems to be a very efficient method. Of course, we haven't tried this with all crops, and we don't know if this is going to apply all over the world. But initial research is certainly indicating that just by promoting our native bees and allowing the soil nesters to nest within our crop areas, we can increase things like crop yield. Right? And then urban impacts, I like to point this one out to really show you how diverse, complex, and really hardy bees are. Right, so in general, urban areas have a low diversity compared to like natural areas, but still not nearly as low as agricultural areas. And that's because urban areas have a varying type of disturbance. There's a lot of available cavities for cavity nesters, and ornamental plants tend to produce a lot of nectar and or pollen. All right, so urban areas actually have a surprising amount of diversity in them. The Bronx of New York has 53 recorded bee species. The adjacent suburb has 110. Chicago recorded 63 species. So it's still low diversity, right? But they are still present. They're there, and they are realizing the niches that are available in that area. Okay, so the whole point of this talk, right, was to adjust your mind as to what a bee species is, or at least what bees are. So instead of referring to bees as something like a honeybee or a bumblebee, it really should be referring to this really large, complex assemblage of species. Right? These bee species are going to vary in almost every aspect of what people actually think bees are going to do. Right? Some, like we said, don't even pollinate flowers, okay? But they're still very important parts of the ecosystem. And then like nesting in hives is rare for bees. So considering all of this, this is my bee collection that I have identified the species. Each group is a different genus. And one way to view this that I like to describe is if it were possible to catch every single bee species that was present in a very pristine habitat or prairie area, you would catch about this many different species. Okay, so again, very large and very complex, especially in healthy habitats. All right, I would like to thank Dr. David Dussard for allowing me to take some of these beautiful stacked image photos. And with that, I will take any questions anyone has.
Thank you so much, Coleman. I always love hearing you talk about native bees.
It's no problem. I love talking about native bees.
I have Priscilla asking if it's possible to get a list of your citations for your presentation. Sorry, yes. Is it possible to get a list of citations?
Yes. I'll email you later a list of those citations. Yes.
Sounds perfect. Priscilla, Coleman also has his email listed, so if you want to just jot that down, he'd be happy to send it to you.
Oh, yes, yes.
Is there a noticeable effect on pollinators when adding the pollinator strip into row crops due to heavy herbicide spraying?
So, is there an effect on the bees? You know, that's interesting. Yes. I would need to, so it's Claire Kremen is really the person that is leading that research. And I'm not sure if they have looked at that particular effect. Her research was more looking at seed set and crop yield. As they were doing that, they weren't really paying very much attention to the communities that were inside of those areas.
Yeah, and I know that there's some research going on at U of A's Extension specifically about, you know, different herbicide and specifically insecticide, you know, effects on honeybees and some of our other native pollinators. So our next question, Coleman, is how do we promote ground nesting bees on our property in town?
So, you know, we don't really have good research on this, so it's hard to like really say, oh, this will definitely work. But looking at what bees like and need, it's really coming up with a diversity of different soil types. And like I said, they really like sand. So having a patch that is more sandy than others is really going to help promote those. Avoiding soil disturbances is a really important thing to promote soil nesting bees. But also there's a lot of plant species that will kind of overcrowd the soil. And so things like lawn grasses really overcrowd the soil and make it inaccessible to bees. So more native species that are a little bit more sparse, and there are small gaps of soil in between them, are much, much better. So it's mostly just promoting that native habitat, using native plants and things like that. Just naturally, the way those plants grow are going to help your soil nesting bees.
Sorry, struggling to find the unmute button. One more question. What is the best time to mow for bees?
The best time to mow?
I'm assuming that what they mean by the question is how can you mow certain areas and have the least impact on our native bee species?
So the best would be to mow as infrequently as possible. So I wouldn't really say that there's a time because you're either cutting flowers, which are important to bees, or you are cutting the pith. Right, so I wouldn't really say that there is a good time to mow. It would be trying to keep it as infrequently as possible. And I guess I could couple that with our information on burning. I know when you do prescribed burning in the fall, that tends to promote more flower species to grow the next year, which in the long run is good for bees. If there is an equivalent to that, to mowing, that would be better as well. Though in my head, mowing is really just, no matter when you do it, promoting grasses, which aren't great for bees either. So
great point, Coleman. Yeah, I feel like a lot of the management techniques that we use to manage, native monarch and pollinator habitat is necessary, and it really outweighs the negative effects on bees. One more question. So microclover is becoming a popular ground cover, which enriches the soil. Is that suitable habitat, or should we avoid microclover? And I don't know what species that is.
Microclover. Hold on one second. One good thing about doing all of this virtually is I've got my stuff right here to look at. All right, so it looks like white clover.
It's also like tiny clover, or like white clover maybe. It's like 4-leaf clover is what she's saying.
Yeah, no, it looks like a smaller sort of white clover. So especially because clovers tend to like to survive in lawns that don't get sprayed with herbicide. A lot of our bee species that we have today rely heavily on white clover. And I mean, certainly if you're looking at that as an alternative or just a general ground cover, from what I just saw, it looked great for bees. Now that is barring that it's, maybe it's really invasive or something, in which I would regret saying that. But as far as a plant providing resources, that is 10 times better than grass. Because you're still going to be getting flowers, and it does look like there at least is if you can see soil in between gaps of plants, there's enough soil for soil nesting bees. And from the pictures that I just looked at, it looked like there was plenty of gaps in between those. So it certainly looks better than lawn grasses. I can say that for sure.
Awesome. Thank you, Coleman. And I will add that there are different ways to, kind of make your front yard or something more suitable. There's different formal native garden designs available online. The Missouri Prairie Foundation's Grow Native website has a bunch of great resources if you're interested. Another question, how long should we leave goldenrod stems for bees overwintering there in our home gardens?
I would say until the next spring, the next growing season really is when I would try to leave them behind. So, I mean, really, when it comes down to it, it's really just make it as natural as you can. The longer you can wait to remove them, the better, right? Because you might even see something else nesting in those the following spring. So really just leaving as many areas as natural as you possibly can is going to help bees as well as monarchs.
I love it. So as kind of a follow-up question for that question, is there, kind of a rule of thumb that, if people really want to clean up some of their formal gardens, is there a date, a rough date that they should wait until after, or maybe a certain period of above a certain temperature of day?
Yeah, I would wait until around late March, just when the next growing season comes around, because anything that is trying to overwinter in a lot of those areas would most likely start to emerge by that point. And it might not be perfect. You might still be selecting to kill one species versus another, but it's still going to be better than if you started the cleanup process right now. So again, leaving all that stuff for the next growing season is definitely the best, but if you can leave it for a little bit longer, it would be even better.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much, Coleman. I know that, people really appreciated your talk, all kinds of great feedback about your answer for the mowing question. Ben is saying, well done, amazing presentation. People learn so much. It's very interesting, and you can tell that you, Coleman, have so much more to say. So great job fitting so much information into such a short amount of time.
It was hard to hold back, and I'm sorry I went a little over.
That's okay. You are our last speaker, so there was a little bit of cushion. So with that said, thank you again so much, Coleman. That was wonderful. And thank you to those who participated in our morning session for day 1 of the 2020 Arkansas Monarch and Pollinator Forum. We will see you back here at 1:30 for the afternoon session. If you haven't registered for it, the registration link is still open, and it is a different Zoom webinar link than the one that you are currently on. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.